Hello lovelies, today we're going to be taking a look at the new Dungeon Master's Guide, the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide 6th edition, they claim not, 5th edition, not exactly. I think that's part of the problem with this newest edition. It doesn't really have its own identity exactly. Now I understand why they did it the way they did it, but still. This DM's guide clocks in at around 384 pages. It has a fold-out map of Greyhawk in the back. No page ribbon for keeping track. Paper stock feels slightly flimsier, but my memory may not be what it once was, he says as his brain stalls. It's early in the morning. Now, I got the alternate cover because they're just better. But I think the camera is creating a slightly false impression of the cover because it seems to be partially metallicized, but you can't see most of the detail normally unless you have a light shining directly on it and apparently a webcam struggling to compensate. It's very low contrast. It's very hard to make out all the details properly. I do prefer the more graphical style of the alternate cover, and I did say when talking about the player's guide that the art was, generally speaking, better than I expected and better than regular 5th edition. But unfortunately this largely stops at the cover here. So yeah, this is a DM's guide which has traditionally tended to house sort of advanced ideas on how to play the game, different ways and things to do, alternate rules, optional rules, all of that sort of thing. You still get some of that here, but it seems to be aimed a lot lower in terms of skill and experience and so on than previous Dungeon Master's guides were. Now, a lot of the advice contained in here is sort of well-duh advice, and while I am generally critical of a lot of games that I review, that they waste time on introductory material and so on, here I don't think that same criticism holds particularly. Of all games, Dungeons and Dragons is most likely to be most people's first ever RPG. That's terrible. It's not a good thing. People need to come in via all kinds of other ways, but yeah, even those of us who didn't have to admit that the vast majority of people come into Dungeons and Dragons via come into role-playing games via Dungeons and Dragons, and that's just the way it is. So as an approach, it's kind of valid here. So some of the kind of patronizing lowest common denominator tone and the obvious advice you can forgive to an extent. They have guidelines on prep time, which is nice to have as guidelines and guidance, but I'm not sure their timings are right. I'm not sure that they've delegated enough time for the preparation that they talk about. When it talks about the role of the games master and everything, it's all a little too nicey. The role of the GM is somewhat undermined, as is the style at the moment. But it's all rhetorical. It's not really enforced via the rules in any way, so it's relatively easy to ignore and kind of go around a bit. I find some of the twee, chocolate boxy cuteness that we see here and there throughout the book a little bit too much, and I do find that patronizing tone and overly simple language, somewhat demeaning. I think the worksheets, let's find one. Are a bit unnecessary. There's one for, there we are. Okay, so we have a travel planner sheet here. Where are they starting? Where are they going? Where are they starting? What's the distance? What's the weather? Where they end? What's the terrain? Fast travel, normal travel, slow travel, narrative notes, challenges, stage 2, stage 3. Okay, so 3-act structure, I guess, to get anywhere. But it's not complex enough to need this. And I worry that this emphasis on these worksheets is going to make any new players that do come in through this edition, of which there'll be mercifully few, I think, it's going to end up making them work in a very formulaic sort of fashion. And tend to make people do things the same way, and that's going to entrench a certain way of playing, rather than throwing it open and being sort of DIY or punk rock about it, where you can do what you want, basically. And so this emphasis on structure and workflow and so on, it's not for me. Safety tools are slipped in here and there, without any particular reference to existing tools and so on, but just in terms of making everything nicey, everyone should get along, everyone should be having fun. It's just tiresome at this point, and I hate having to restate it. There needs, to my mind, to be more emphasis on compromise, on sucking it up, on, you may, as a player, you may not get everything you want out of every session. Someone else might, but then you might get what you want the next session. So yeah, there needs to be more emphasis on compromise and finding your fun, rather than expecting the games master, dungeon master, to serve it up on a platter for you, and how you shouldn't expect to be completely blown away by everything every session, and that your particular peccadillos and fetishes shouldn't necessarily be indulged every session, and that the games master is another player. There's a bit of that. There's a little bit about respect for the dungeon master, but it's framed in this patronizing, cutesy style that everything is in, that makes the dungeon master seem more like a kindergarten teacher or something. So I guess those are my two main complaints. Are that it talks down to you. It's not aspirational. It doesn't make you work for it very much, and that it is so formulaic. I mean, it's less structured and less formal than, say, some Japanese RPGs, but it is still overly constructed. If you've watched my reviews of Japanese RPGs, I think it's a cultural thing, but RPGs with a Japanese, or more broadly an Asian origin, are often very, very tightly structured. You do this in this order, then you go on to do this in this order, then you go on to do this in this order, and then you resolve it in this way, and that's how every adventure is supposed to go. Yeah, if you look at something like Convictor Drive, in particular, that would be a good example of that sort of thing. And there's a sense of some of that going on here. Maybe it's just a reflection that people have less time these days. I don't know. So if you have a formulaic structure, it's easier to kind of go through the motions and end up with something resembling a D&D session at the end of the day. I mean, having a formulaic structure never hurt paranoia. So I don't know. Maybe I'm being unfair in complaining in this way. The narration guidance is good, but like a lot of content in this book, it doesn't really go far enough for me. Similarly, there's good advice on social interactions, but again, it doesn't really go far enough, and it has some peculiar ideas like suggesting using non-social stats and skills in social situations, which undermines the niche protection of socially oriented characters. Though I guess, strictly speaking, none of the classes are socially oriented, even the bard. It uses imperial measurements throughout, which is somewhat distressing because Fahrenheit means nothing to me. There's a lot of random tables, but they lack depth, which means if you do use the random tables for more than one session, more than one character, or group, odds are you're going to run into the same sort of random rolls over and over again. And this is a complaint I have about a lot of games that rely on tables. There just simply aren't enough entries or enough permutations for it to actually be that useful. The book as a whole, it hits this spot exactly wrong between giving you too much information to be sort of generalized, as a sort of general useful guideline. So you've got too much information and too much specificity for it to be a good sort of general guideline for creating monsters or spells or magic items or encounters or whatever else, but then not quite also giving you enough to be truly useful. So it hits this sweet spot consistently of being deeply unsatisfying in what it provides. It's kind of intriguing you. Oh, something like this could be useful. Oh, there's not enough information here. So I'm not sure how much this is going to be used. They do have some decent mob rules, which are a nice idea, but they do involve automatic hits and average damage, which is just kind of meh. I think the dramatic swings in fortune are a big part of what makes or has made D&D and a lot of role-playing games interesting. When everything rides on that die roll, it's a similar sort of tweak to your brain chemistry that gambling gives you, I think. But it's nice to have those mob rules. It's just I tend to find that automatic hits and average damage is disempowering. There's no room for luck, and there's not as much room for tactics. And that's something we definitely found playing Zombicide Chronicles and to a lesser extent Black Plague. The auto hits and auto damage are just kind of disappointing and disempowering to you as a player and a dungeon master or games master as well. They have settlement rules, but it doesn't include hamlets or thorps anymore, and doesn't go as high as like I could never say this word, Ecumenopolis, world cities, and that's emblematic of the problem that it lacks that kind of aspirational quality that I mentioned before. When I first read the old DM's guides or other game books, I don't know what the fuck a hamlet or a thorp was, and I had to go and look it up. In the days pre-internet, so there used to be encouragement from games to learn things, whether it's the sheer variety of medieval polearms available, thanks Gary, or different scales of settlement and what different types of settlement were called and what they tended to be, what they tended to do, all of that sort of thing. So to me that's just emblematic of the kind of dumbing down of the whole thing to a large extent. Some of that's fine, you want to bring new people into the games, you want it to be accessible, but then maybe you should do like a basic set instead, because that worked by building on the previous foundations as you went through the different types, and I don't think anyone's ever done it better. But there you go. The encounter budget for monsters, I didn't go deep into the mathematics, but it does seem higher, which compensates for all the additional levels of power that characters can get from various things throughout, old 5th edition and throughout the new one, in which characters tend to be a bit more powerful as well. So the encounter budget seems higher, but again they've dumbed it down from, I think, 5 levels to 3 levels. So low, moderate, high, challenge, basically, for different characters, and that gives you an experience point budget that you can then spend on creatures. And the encounter budget seems to be higher for low and moderate encounters, and roughly the same for high/deadly encounters, which means the big encounters don't feel like they've been compensated for, but the lower level encounters that you're going to run into more often feel like they should be more challenging, or at least have reset the challenge level somewhat. So overall, the art, there's a few good pieces, but overall it's quite tacky, twee, that whole direction we've seen throughout, certainly latter 5th edition, and even from the start. That disappointed me, because I was really happy to see a lot of the more graphical art that was present in the player's guide. So this was a disappointment on that score. When it comes to Greyhawk, I don't feel that I'm really qualified to comment on the material. I read some of the gazetteers. I was rather distracted by all the sexy drow elves, must be said. But I can't help but feel that the section on Greyhawk probably should have been removed, and one of their early releases for this pseudo edition should have been a Greyhawk campaign book, something like the old 3rd edition Forgotten Realms campaign book. That's what I feel they should have done. Inserting it here feels kind of wasted space, and it's not enough space to be useful. So, there's that problem of hitting exactly the wrong sweet spot here that I've mentioned. And this overall problem of not enough to be really useful is especially obvious when it comes to the much vaunted and much trumpeted Bastion system. There's stuff that other people have complained about, that Bastions should be safe spaces for the players and blah, 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 blah. I mean, you can ignore that easy enough. That doesn't bother me too much. What bothers me is it just doesn't feel that thought through. It's yet another thing you get as you level, rather than necessarily being something you could perhaps pour your resources into. So you have to have the resources and you have to have the level. But there are restrictions on the kinds of things that can be there, and they are level locked. Like a forge. Practically every village is going to have either a smith or a farrier with access to a forge, and yet you can't have one till level 5. And, most peasants are never going to make it to level 5, unless we're saying every commoner who works a forge is at least level 5. It just doesn't make sense. As long as you have the money, you should be able to add a forge to your bastion and hire a smith or whatever else. So it doesn't dovetail with the rest of the system, with the idea of hirelings. It doesn't make any sense. And yeah, again, hits that sweet spot of not being one thing or the other, neither fish nor fowl. So overall then, I mean, it's okay. It's kind of generic advice for the most part. It hits this problem of not being enough and yet at the same time being too much, and not feeling thought through, which can't be the case. Surely, surely they must have thought this through, but apparently no, they haven't. But yeah, it is for new DMs. Certainly, it's worthwhile. For intermediate and higher level DMs with more experience, you could probably do without it. I mean, it's useful for reference and sort of gauging threat levels and traps and things like that. So I'm not going to say it's completely useless, but it's not that great at all either. Style-wise, contextually to Wizards of the Coast budget and so on, it's disappointing, but at the lower end of average. So 3 for style. In terms of substance, it's got bits and pieces, but it never really goes far enough in any of them, and a lot of them don't make consistent sense within the plausible scope of the world. So in terms of substance, it's going to be also a low 3. So that is 6 out of 10. 3 out of 5. Deeply, deeply average in the damning with faint praise words of Roger Corman. It's good enough. Zang.
Fatal Highway is a set of post-apocalyptic road war rules for Fate. This is a quick set of tried and tested rules for vehicles, vehicle chases, vehicle weapons, and operating at scale. This version also contains some ideas written up for a Fate version of 45 Psychobilly Retropocalypse. This booklet is all about cars, chases, crashes, and some post-apocalyptic inspiration for those who want to play Road Warriors. You can purchase it at post-mort.com, lulu.com, and DriveThruRPG.
Well, I look at it myself as the beginning, really, of an exploration. That's the reason we're exploring. You don't know what you'll run into on an exploration. What the sky looks like, what the stars look like. Do they still twinkle, or are they a steady light when you get outside the atmosphere?